Welcome to my channel. This is Captain Binoy Varakil, Assistant Professor, Department of English, St. Joseph's College at Kozhikode, Kerala. Today we begin a series of lectures on the Poetics of Aristotle, and this series of lectures are meant for the postgraduate students of MA English of the colleges of University of Calicut. And we know the significance of Aristotle's the Poetics. Aristotle, together with Socrates and Plato, is one of the most important founding figures in Western philosophy. He was the first to create a comprehensive system of philosophy encompassing morality and aesthetics, logic and science, politics and metaphysics. Aristotle's views on the physical sciences profoundly shaped the medieval scholarship, and their influence extended well into the Renaissance, although they were ultimately replaced by modern physics. So, in this series of lectures, we are looking at the Poetics of Aristotle, and the Poetics is Aristotle's attempt to explain the basic problems of art. He both defines art and offers criteria for determining the quality of a given artwork. The Poetics stands in opposition to the theory of art propounded by Aristotle's teacher Plato. In his Republic, Plato argues that poetry is a representation of mere appearances and is thus misleading and morally suspect. In the Poetics, Aristotle, Plato's student, attempts to refute his teacher by exploring what unites all poetry, its imitative nature and its ability to bring an audience into its specific plot while preserving a unity of purpose and theme. The tone of the Poetics reflects its argumentative spirit, as Aristotle attempts both to explain the anatomy of poetry and to justify its value to human society. Despite its broad goals, however, Aristotle's arguments are quite concrete. He is less interested in the abstract existence of art than he is in looking at specific artworks by specific playwrights. Aristotle wants to explain why effective poetry has stayed with audiences for so long. He tends to look for empirical evidence, that is, sensory proof through past observation, that art is both good and useful, no matter how philosophers like Plato try to dismiss it. Now that we have studied the Republic of Plato, we know that Aristotle differs from his master Plato. When we learn the Poetics of Aristotle, it's good that we remember we have the Holy Trinity of Greek masters, and the Holy Trinity of Greek masters are Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. And of course, it is good that we remember maybe some of the important ideas of these three when we look at Aristotle as well as the Poetics of Aristotle. So we know that Plato was the most celebrated disciple of Socrates. By the time of Socrates, the glory of Athenian art and literature, illustrated in the works of artists like Phidias, Polygnotus, and writers like Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides and Aristophanes, was on the wane, and their place was taken by philosophy and oratory. Plato was not a professed critic of literature, and his critical observations are not embodied in any single work. His chief interest was philosophical investigation, which forms the subject of his great work, the Dialogues. The dialogues are so called, as we have seen in the Republic, or rather while discussing the Republic, we know that the dialogues are so called because each question that interested Plato is discussed there in question and answer form by a number of interlocutors, the chief of whom is Socrates. And let us just understand Plato's view of art. As literature is an art, like painting, sculpture, and others, what Plato thought of art in general deserves the first consideration. It is intimately bound up with what is called his theory of ideas. Ideas, Plato says in the Republic, are the ultimate reality. Everything in the world is the copy of the idea. A tree, thus, is nothing more than a concrete embodiment of its image in idea. Now, art, literature, painting, sculpture reproduces but things as mere pastime, the first in words, the next in colors, and the last in stone. So it merely copies a copy. It is twice removed from reality. Things themselves being imperfect copies of the ideas from which they spring, their reproduction in art must be more imperfect still. They take men away from reality rather than towards it. At best, they are but partial images of it. So the productions of art helped neither to mold character nor to promote the well-being of the state, the two things by which Plato judged all human endeavor. Plato attacked poetry, and now let us look at his basic charges against art. Plato's basic charges against art. The same concern for the good of the individual and the state marks Plato's announcements on poetry. Judging by these twin standards, he finds more in it to condemn than to approve. The first ground of his condemnation of art has already been stated above: its incapacity as an art to get to the root of things. Being concerned with only a semblance of them, art is twice removed from reality. And under the following grounds, Plato condemns poetry. The first is poetic inspiration, the second, emotional appeal of poetry, and third, its non-moral character. Let's look at how or why Plato condemns poetry on the ground of poetic inspiration. Poet writes not because he has thought long over what he has to say, but because he is inspired. The muse suddenly fills him and makes him sing. Can such a sudden outpouring of the soul be reliable? Or can such a sudden outpouring of the soul be a reliable substitute for truths based on reason. Often, no doubt, the poet's utterances contain a profound truth, but this appears only when they have been subjected to a further test, the test of reason. By themselves, they are not safe guides. Poetry therefore cannot take the place of philosophy. Guided chiefly by the impulse of the moment, instead of cool deliberation like philosophy, it cannot be relied upon to make the individual a better citizen and the state better organization. There were therefore to be no poets in the ideal commonwealth envisaged in the Republic, unless they happened to be those who composed hymns to the gods and panegyrics or praises on famous men. And besides this, Plato also condemns poetry on the ground of emotional appeal of poetry. Plato's next charge against poetry arises from its appeal to the emotions. Being a product of inspiration, it affects the emotions rather than the reason, the heart rather than the intellect. As an art too, with beauty of form added to the original inspiration, it does the same. Its pictures of life, therefore, of characters, scenes, or situations overpower the emotions and hold the reason prisoner. Now, emotions being just impulses of the moment, like the poetic inspiration mentioned above, cannot be such safeguards as reason, which consider everything coolly before allowing itself to move in any direction. Plato illustrates this with reference to the tragic poetry of his age, in which weeping and wailing were indulged to the full to move the hearts of the spectators. Poetry fed and watered the passions instead of drying them up, and let them rule instead of ruling them as they ought to be ruled, with a view to the happiness and virtue of mankind. Now let us look at non-moral character of poetry. Finally, Plato indicts poetry for its lack of concern with morality. In its treatment of life, it treats both virtue and vice alike, sometimes making the one and sometimes the other triumph indifferently without regard for moral considerations. It pained Plato to see virtue often coming to grief in the literature esteemed in his day. The topics of Homer, the narrative verse of Hesiod, the odes of Pindar, and the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. In his own words from the Republic, they give us to understand that many evil lives are happy and many righteous men unhappy, and that wrongdoing, if it be undetected, is profitable, while honest dealing is beneficial to one's neighbor but damaging to oneself. Their portraits of gods and heroes are equally objectionable. Both are often represented in the most unfavorable light. Gods as unjust or revengeful or guilty of other vices, and heroes suffer from uncontrollable passion of kinds, pride, anger, grief, and so on. Such literature corrupted both the citizen and the state. Now, the function of poetry, according to Plato, is morality, not pleasure. This naturally leads Plato to consider the function of poetry. Although it pleases mere pleasure, he says, cannot be its object. He cannot conceive of art as divorced from morals. Everywhere, therefore, he suggests truth as the test of poetry. What contribution it makes to the knowledge of virtue. A poet is a good artist only insofar as he is a good teacher. In a passage in the Republic, he says, we must look for artists who are able, out of the goodness of their own natures, to trace the nature of beauty and perfection. That so our young men, like persons who live in a healthy place, may be perpetually influenced for good. Poetic truth must be the highest truth, ideal form of justice, goodness, beauty, and the like. Now, let's look at Plato's comments on drama. All the observations of Plato given so far apply equally to dramatic writing, which formed but a branch of poetry. The representations of drama are as much removed from reality, as much a product of inspiration, as much emotional in appeal, and as much unconcerned with morality as those of poetry. Yes, but there are few more things that Plato says of the dramatic art in particular which deserve separate notice. Its appeal to baser instincts, or drama appeals to baser instincts according to Plato. Unlike poetry, drama is meant to be staged. Its approval or disapproval therefore depends upon a heterogeneous multitude. In order to please them all, the dramatist often introduces what they like, such as quarrels and lamentations in tragedy, and imitation of thunder and cries of beasts in comedy. All this arouses their instincts, of which they themselves will be ashamed in normal life. It leads to bad taste and laxity in discipline. Such plays, therefore, Plato will have ruthlessly censored. Now, his second comment on drama, Plato's second comment on drama, is about the effects of impersonation. Sometimes drama reacts unfavorably on the actors themselves. By constantly impersonating evil characters like cowards, knaves, and criminals, they let these evil qualities enter into their own nature to the detriment of their natural self. Nor is acting even of the innocent sort a healthy exercise. It represses individuality and leads to the enfeeblement of character. Plato admits, however, that where the character impersonated represent the cream of humanity, such as men of courage, wisdom, or virtue, the actor stands to gain. By the force of habit, again, the same qualities are stimulated in him. Those tragedies that represent the best and noblest in life are of positive benefit to the community and deserve to be encouraged. And according to Plato, drama has tragic and comic pleasure, and let us look at that. Human nature, Plato says, is a mixture of heterogeneous feelings, anger, envy, fear, grief, and others, which are no doubt painful by themselves but afford pleasure when indulged in excess, and it happens in drama. Now, let us just look at the value of Plato's criticism. Plato was the first to see that all art is mimesis or imitation, imitating the objects of life or nature, and that there are two kinds of arts, the fine arts and the useful arts. Like literature, painting, sculpture, and music, which are indulged in for mere pleasure, and the useful arts like medicine, agriculture, and cookery that cooperate with nature. We owe the division of poetry. He divides poetry into two, the purely lyrical and the purely imitative. Now let's look at the biographical details of Aristotle before looking at the Poetics. Aristotle is believed to have lived between 384 BC to 322 BC. He was born in Stagira in Chalcidice in 384 BC, and his father was the personal physician to King Amyntas of Macedonia. Aristotle was trained and educated as a member of the aristocracy. At the age of 18, he went to Athens to continue his education at Plato's academy. Aristotle remained at the academy for nearly 20 years, not leaving until after Plato's death in 348 BC. Aristotle, after the death of Plato, traveled to Asia Minor. There he married Pythias. Pythias bore him a daughter whom they named Pythias. Later, Aristotle was invited by Philip of Macedonia to become tutor to Alexander the Great, and is said to have disciplined him by whipping. Aristotle returned to Athens in 335 BC and established his own school known as Lyceum. Aristotle conducted courses at the school for the next 12 years. While in Athens, his wife died. His wife, that is of course Pythias, died, and he became later involved with Herpilis of Stagira, another lady, who bore him a son whom he named after his father Nicomachus. Aristotle lectured on physics, metaphysics, Nicomachean ethics, politics, anatomy, astronomy, economics, embryology, geography, geology, meteorology, zoology, and de anima, or on the soul. He wrote on many dialogues, or rather he wrote on many subjects, only fragments of which survived. These works that have survived are in treaty form and were not for the most part intended for widespread publication, as they are generally thought to be lectures, or rather lecture aids or lecture notes for his students. And some of his most important treatises include physics, metaphysics, Nicomachean ethics, politics, de anima, and the poetics, etc. He, in fact, not only studied almost every subject possible at the time, but made significant contributions to most of them. And he studied education, foreign customs, literature, and poetry. In 322 BC, Aristotle died in Euboea of natural causes and was buried next to his wife. Now, we will look at the Poetics prescribed for us. We are looking at each and every chapter of the Poetics, and we know that the Poetics has 26 chapters, right? And today in this lecture we will be looking at the introduction and of course the first two chapters of Poetics. But in subsequent lectures we'll be looking at the major themes in the Poetics. So also some of the very important terms that Aristotle used in the Poetics. We'll also be looking at some important questions and answers. And now let us look at the different chapters of the Poetics. In fact, the Poetics, as we know, was of course it should have been a big text, but we lost many of the chapters of the manuscript, and the manuscript that is just available to of course his students was of just 26 chapters, and there it would have been a bigger book with many more chapters, but we have only 26 chapters left with us in the manuscripts, right? So we will be looking at each of the 26 chapters, the content of each of the 26 chapters. And when we look at the chapters, we understand that chapters 1 to 4, the first, second, third, fourth, and the 25th chapters, okay, so altogether 5 chapters are devoted to poetry in general, and the other chapters are about drama, especially tragedy. He speaks about tragedy. Aristotle speaks about tragedy. Aristotle also speaks about comedy. He compares tragedy, then epic, and of course we will look at all that later. And now let us look at he has an introduction for the Poetics. Let us look at the introduction, what Aristotle speak about, what does he say in the introduction of the Poetics. Aristotle begins with a loose outline of what he will address in the Poetics. He tells us what is his intention in the Poetics, or rather those lectures in the Poetics. Okay, so thereafter he proposes, right? He proposes to speak about poetry and the different kinds of poetry and the essential quality of each kinds of poetry. And he is again intending to, or he proposes to speak about the structure necessary for a good poem, and the method in which a poem is divided into parts. He will also speak about the method in which a poem is divided into parts. And he says that he will also speak about anything else that might come up in his mind, of course, or rather in his address of the above topics, like the different kinds of poetry and the structure necessary for a good poem. But before he begins tackling these topics, Aristotle first seeks to define poetry. And poetry, according to him, is the first and foremost a medium of imitation. It's a medium of imitation, which means a form of art that seeks to duplicate or represent life. Poetry can imitate life in a number of ways by representing character, emotion, action, or even everyday objects. Poetry, as Aristotle defines it, includes epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, dithyrambic poetry, and music. Say the flute, the lyre, etc. What differentiates these kinds of poetry is the nature of their imitation. Poetry differ from one another in three respects. That is, either in using different media for representation, or in representing different things, or in representing them in entirely different ways. And now let us just look at chapter 1. Chapter 1 of the Poetics of Aristotle is titled The Media of Poetic Imitation. And he, in this chapter, consolidates that poetry imitates life through rhythm, language, and harmony. In general, poetry imitates life through rhythm, language, and harmony. Some artists represent things by imitating their shapes and colors, and others do so by the use of voice. The art of flute and lyre consists only in music and rhythm. So does any of the same type, such as that of the pipes. The medium of dances is rhythm. They represent men's character and feelings and actions through proper arrangement of the rhythms of their movements. The nature of writing in verse makes a poet. And according to Aristotle, both Homer and Empedocles are considered poets because they write in verse. But Homer is a poet, whereas Empedocles is a natural philosopher. There are some arts which use all the media, like of course the shape, the color, and of course the voice. Like maybe we can say that some arts which use all the media, like rhythm, music, and formal meter. Example, the dithyrambic or the nomic poetry. And tragedy and comedy use these media separately, only after another. So these are some of the ideas that Aristotle speak about in the first chapter of the Poetics. And now we move on to the second chapter. Second chapter is titled Object of Poetic Imitation. The objects of poetic. It's not the object, there is an error. Objects of poetic imitation. And art seeks, according to Aristotle, art seeks to imitate men in action. Hence the term drama. The term drama is used because art is imitating men in action. In order to imitate men, art must either present man as better than they are in life, of higher morals, or as true to life, or as worse than they are in real life. So these are the three ways in which men are presented in, of course, drama or art. Men are presented as better than they are in life. Number two, as true to life as they are in real life, or as worse than they are in real life. And each author has his own tendencies. Say, for example, Homer makes men better than they are, and Cleophon represents normal types of human beings, or rather presents them as they are in reality, okay, as true to life. And Nicocharis as well as Hegemon of Thasos represent men worse than they are, rather show them in a bad light. Okay, so Homer depicts better, in a better way, men in action in a better way, and Cleophon represents men in, of course, the normal way as they are in reality, and Hegemon of Thasos and Nicocharis show men in worse way, in a bad light. Okay, and the end of the chapter 2, Aristotle is just separating, or he just speaks to us about comedy and tragedy. Like he says that based on the representation of men in drama, like if you present them in a better way, you have, of course, tragedy. You present them in a worse way, you have comedy. Okay, so it is, of course, comedy. Yeah, Aristotle says this way: comedy represents men as worse than they are in reality, tragedy as better than they are in actual life. So with these references, chapter 2 of the Poetics comes to an end, and the subsequent chapters of the Poetics will be discussing in the next video lecture. We will complete analysis, or we'll have complete analysis of all the chapters of the Poetics in this series of lectures. Besides, we'll be looking at the important themes and questions based on the Poetics of Aristotle. Thanks a lot for listening. May God bless you all. Bye-bye.